Hi, I'm Chet Haas from the Android development team. I work on graphics and animations, and today I wanted to talk about animations. Specifically, I want to talk about activity animations. So typically when an activity launches, or even a sub-activity, you get standard animations from the window manager, and you can choose the kind of animation that you want. You can load in a resource for this, and as of Jelly Bean, we also allow you to specify a thumbnail that you can scale from and potentially crossfade from. But that's about it. There's not a lot of customization possible with window animations. What if you want to do something really custom? So we're going to see how to do that today. So if we run this little demo called Activity Animations, you see as we have the main activity with these grayscale thumbnails, and we click on one of those thumbnails, and we launch into the sub-activity that shows a detailed view of the picture and then the text that goes along with the picture. So again, click on the thumbnail, it colorizes the picture, it zooms up into the full-scale view, and we see the text slide out from underneath the picture. Kind of nice. We can slow down the animation so we can see it a little bit more in detail, and you see there's also a drop shadow in there giving you the effect of the picture really popping out toward the viewer and then popping back when the activity goes back to the main activity. So how do we do that? So the main idea behind this is that we disable window animations because we don't actually want them to do anything that they're used to doing. Instead, we launch the sub-activity immediately, or we launch the activity that we're going back to immediately, and then we run custom animations using the normal property animation system. And once we're into the activity with property animations, you can do anything you want. So again, we disable window animations, we get into the activity, and then in the activity we can do whatever we want. And the trick with handling these sort of inter-activity things, like launching from a thumbnail from one into a full-scale view of the other, is to pass the information in a bundle so that we have the appropriate information that we can key off of to get the effect that we're looking for. So first of all, let's take a look at the application manifest here. And we can see that we've set up a style of our sub-activity of transparent, and this is something that I've defined in the styles.xml file. So we have the seam transparent, where we say the window background is transparent. This means that when the sub-activity launches, it's not actually going to paint a default color over the activity that we're launching from, which is the effect that we want. We want the activity to launch immediately, but we don't want that obvious to the user by seeing some opaque color drawn in front of the previous activity. Instead, we want it to launch transparently and then do its thing. Now, one important caveat about transparent activities is this means that the window manager in the system is going to be drawing the other activity behind there. Every time the window is drawn on the screen, it's going to have to draw the activity behind it. This could potentially be a performance issue, so it's not something you want to do in every situation. And if it's a really complex set of views that you're dealing with there, maybe it's not something you want to do. But for this sort of transient behavior of going from one activity to the other, it's a pretty neat effect, but you just need to be able to determine the correct trade-off for your own application. Anyway, let's take a look at the actual code. So there's a few things going on here. One is that we have this main activity called Activity Animations. We set up a color matrix color filter, arguably the longest class name in the Android framework. And this is to create the grayscale effect on those thumbnails. So we're loading these full-scale images, we're creating thumbnails out of them, and then we're setting a filter which will make them appear as grayscale in the thumbnail view. And then we're going to launch from the thumbnail into the colorized view. So we're going to set up grayscale filters on those, we're going to set up a layout, we're going to load in the pictures and add them to the layout. Nothing really amazing going on here. And then we're going to set a click listener so that we know whenever we click on a particular thumbnail, then our listener is going to kick in and will do the appropriate thing. So that happens down here on click listener. So here we're going to package up the information that we need to pass to the sub-activity so that it knows where to launch its picture from, where to zoom in from, and what picture to zoom in from so that it can do the correct animation into the full view of that picture. So here we figure out where the thumbnail is on the screen, how large it is, and also the orientation. I'll talk about this a little bit later. And then the resource ID of the picture. So we're going to give all the information that the sub-activity needs to know where and what size to zoom in from, as well as what picture to actually zoom into. And then the text description as well that's associated with the picture. We put all of this into the extras, so we're going to launch this sub-activity with this extra information, and then the sub-activity can extract it. Now here's an important point. If you're doing this technique, you want to override pending transitions after you've started the activity, and this will tell the window manager to back off and not run the standard window animations on top of what you're already trying to do in your custom activity animations. Okay, so that's all. Not much going on in the main activity. All the interesting bit is in the sub-activity. So let's take a look at that. In picture details activity file, we have various fields that we need. We have a couple of custom interpolators that we've defined there for the animations. And then we get down here into the onCreate. This is going to be called when the activity launches. And at that point, we can extract the bundle, which is the information that we packaged up about the thumbnail that we're actually launching from. So from that, we get all the information about location, size, the picture, the text description, all that stuff. And then we can actually run our animations. So we come down here. This is an important point here. If the saved instance state is null, then we want to go ahead and run the information. If not, then we're actually launching the sub-activity from something like returning to it from the launcher. Maybe somebody launches your activity from recents. We don't want to do the custom animation in that case. We just want to launch the activity with a standard animation. But if the saved instance state is null, then we will launch from the main activity. So let's go ahead and run the animation. Okay, so here's a technique that I use in a lot of my animation demos, which is an on-pre-draw listener. This gets called right before we're about to draw things, which is an excellent time to track information that's going to be set up prior to that first draw. In particular, we want to know where everything's going to be, like our main picture view. Everything's going to be set up to be rendered in the main activity. And this is the time for us to kick in and say, okay, now that we know where everything's going to be, now we can run our animation to animate from where it was in the previous activity into this sub-activity. So we handle the on pre-draw, we remove the listener because we don't want to listen to it after this. That would be silly. Then we get the location on the screen of the picture that we're going to. We also get the size, and then we create scale factors. And this basically, the technique that we're going to use in the animation is we're going to pre-scale down to the size of the thumbnail that we're coming from, and then we're going to scale up to 1. Right? So we have the full size of the image. We're going to pre-scale it down to some fractional size, and then scale it up to 1 until it reaches the full size. And then we run the enter animation. Here's another important point. If you override on pre-draw listener, return true. By default, IDEs like to have you return false, which is silly, because that basically disables rendering on this frame. We wanted to go ahead and draw the first frame, so return true. It's the right thing to do. Then we run the enter animation. We calculate a duration based on whether we've enabled that scale animation property in the menu. No big deal there. We set up some initial values. So the pivot point that we're scaling around, the scale factor that we're going to scale down to before we start the animation, and then the translation X and Y. So we're going to scale from a particular size and from a particular location. We also tell the text view, which is going to hold the text description for the picture, to alpha of 0, so it's going to be initially transparent, then we're going to fade it in. Here's the main animation. So for the image view, we're going to run a view property animator at that duration we calculated earlier. We're going to scale X and Y into 1, so it's going to be the full size of the picture when it's done. Translation X and Y, translation Y are going to go to 0 from that initial location they had from the thumbnail that we're launching from. We're going to have a decelerate interpolator, which means it's going to start fast and then slow down and lock into place. And then when the animation ends, we're going to run the following runnable, which is going to go ahead and start the text view animation. So we're going to set the translation Y to be basically up underneath the picture, and then we're going to animate it down to translation Y of 0, and we're going to fade it in at the same time, again using a view property animator on the text view itself. In parallel, we're going to fade in a black background. So if we see the demo again, you can see that we're fading in the background to this opaque black background behind the picture once we're finally done. So that's going to happen in parallel. So we're going to animate the alpha value of this background that we've already defined. We're also going to run a colorizer animation. Now this is not a standard property. Instead, it's a property that I've defined on this class called saturation. So I just created a property setter called set saturation, which we'll see down below. And we're going to run that from 0 to 1. And as that runs, we're going to change the color filter, which is going to colorize that image from the initial grayscale up into the full color version of the picture. And we're also going to animate a drop shadow. We'll see how the rendering of this works in a minute, but it's enough now to know that we're going to animate the shadow depth from 0, which is basically the shadow is going to be exactly mapped behind the image, to some offset value, which we'll then use to calculate alpha as well as offsets for the shadow. And the idea here is that we want to start with the thumbnail starting on the plane that we're projecting onto, and then as the thumbnail pops out, we want the shadow to help give the illusion that the image is actually popping out toward the user. and then we start the animation. So we also have a run exit animation. It's basically the same animations in reverse, so I won't go through the code there. But there's some other interesting bits to look at here. One is the saturation. This is the property setter that I defined that's going to be called by the object animator. We're going to set the saturation on the color matrix, and then we're going to define a new filter and set it on the drawable. This is an important point. We can't animate the filter itself because it's not a mutable object. Instead, we need to create a new filter with this saturation value and then set that on the drawable, and that's how we animate the colorization of the drawable itself. Two more points here is on back pressed, we override this so that when the back button is pressed, we'd like to go back into the main activity, but we want to animate that. And to do that, we need to run the animation and then finish the activity. By default, on back press simply runs finish immediately. What we want to do is run our animation first, which is going to happen in that method that I skipped before, run exit animation, and then when it's done, this runnable is going to execute, and that's going to call finish. We also override finish for the sole reason of overriding pending transitions. Same as before, I don't want window animations to run when I'm returning to the main activity because I have my own custom animation to run. Only one more detail here is the shadow layout. This is a neat rendering trick for drawing shadows. This is sort of a general container that will draw shadows behind all children. In this particular case, it's just drawing shadows behind the one child that our container has, which is this, this image that we're animating into. So we set up some initial values here. We use a trick of blurring the edges because it's kind of nice to have this sort of blurry anti-aliased edge to the shadow. So we draw a round rect with the blur into this bitmap, and then we're going to draw the bitmap the appropriate size whenever we render ourselves. This property setter is going to be called by the object animator, which animates the shadow depth. So it's going to set a couple of values in here, including the alpha on the paint that we're going to render with, and then we invalidate this container so that we can actually have a chance to render our shadow as we draw. And then on draw, we override to actually draw the shadows behind all of our children. So we're going to walk through all of our children. In this particular case, there's only one, but you could see how maybe there would be several children that we want to draw with this shadow. So we're going to get the child. We're going to calculate a depth factor here. We're going to set some values on the canvas that we're drawing with. Specifically, we're going to translate to where we want the shadow. And then we're going to go ahead and draw the bitmap that we created before. And that's it. Again, an important point is transparent activities aren't a good idea in general for performance reasons, but if you really want a custom animation going into that sub-activity, this is a pretty good way to go about it. You can check out information about the code itself at a link that's provided in the description of the video, and check out the other DevBytes for more animation information. Thanks.